The night Elena Markov died inside Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center was quiet in the way hospitals always are after visiting hours, when the building seems to breathe on its own and the city outside fades into a distant hum. And Elena, a meticulous clinical researcher known for staying late and trusting the routines of the hospital, sent her husband Daniel a short message saying she would be home after finishing one last review of grant data, a decision that would become the final ordinary act of her life. Security logs later showed her badge granting access to a restricted administrative corridor just after 10:40. Coffee in hand, posture relaxed, unaware that the systems she trusted would soon betray her. At 11 o'clock, she entered a research office, and by 11:57, a motion sensor in a nearby stairwell activated briefly, a detail that initially seemed insignificant until investigators realized the sensor required prolonged presence, not a sudden fall. Just after midnight, a custodian discovered Elena at the base of the stairs, with injuries inconsistent with an accidental tumble. Her phone still in her pocket, unlocked, with an unsent message frozen on the screen as if she had been interrupted mid-thought. Toxicology results complicated everything when traces of a sedative were found in her bloodstream. Not enough to incapacitate completely, but enough to slow reflexes, raising the possibility that Elena had not been fully in control when she went down the stairs. As the investigation shifted from accident to suspicious death, attention turned quickly to Daniel, a former biotech sales executive struggling financially and, according to neighbors, locked in quiet arguments with Elena about work, money, and a future that felt increasingly out of reach. Detectives noted his calm demeanor at the hospital, his early questions about insurance, and the recent increase Elena had made to her life policy, naming him as beneficiary. Details that fit too neatly into a familiar narrative of motive and opportunity. Daniel's inability to account for a short window of time that night, combined with his past access to pharmaceutical trial materials, made him an easy focus, and public opinion hardened long before evidence did, casting him as the likely cause of his wife's death. But the case began to unravel when a junior analyst took a closer look at the security data and noticed that the stairwell sensor had been triggered in a way that suggested someone had been standing there, not falling, and that the sedative in Elena's system was not one Daniel could have obtained, but a compound stored in a restricted lab she did not use. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered an internal complaint Elena had filed weeks earlier, accusing a senior researcher of manipulating data tied to millions in grant funding, a complaint that had quietly stalled before reaching human resources. Access logs revealed another badge in the corridor that night, belonging to someone with far more to lose than a strained marriage, and Daniel's missing phone activity aligned with a dead zone in the hospital he never entered, weakening the case against him just as it had seemed strongest. No charges were filed, the death was eventually reclassified as undetermined, and the hospital cited procedural failures after a senior researcher resigned months later for reasons never publicly connected to Elena's case, leaving behind a story that ended not with justice but with doubt, where the most unsettling possibility was not that a husband had killed his wife, but that the truth had been quietly absorbed by an institution built to protect life, not confront what happens when power and silence intersect. In the months after Elena Markov's death, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center returned outwardly to routine, but beneath the polished floors and late-night corridors, the case continued to echo in small, uneasy ways, especially for the people who had brushed against Elena in her final weeks, and could not shake the feeling that something had been deliberately buried. Daniel Markov moved out of their apartment and out of public view, his name still tethered to suspicion in online forums and whispered conversations, even as detectives quietly conceded There was no evidence strong enough to charge him. A limbo that left him grieving without innocence and defended without vindication. Investigators, constrained by legal boundaries and institutional reluctance, began to focus less on who might have pushed Elena and more on what she had been trying to expose, reconstructing her last days through emails, version histories, and server access logs that revealed a growing pattern of late-night revisions to data she did not control, and comments she left flagged as urgent and ethically compromised. Colleagues remembered Elena becoming unusually tense, lowering her voice when discussing work, once joking darkly that hospitals were safer for patients than for truth, a remark that felt prophetic in hindsight. The internal complaint she filed, now partially unsealed, showed she had accused a senior researcher of selectively omitting negative trial outcomes to secure continued funding, and the timestamps on her drafts suggested she had been preparing to escalate the issue beyond the hospital just days before her death. As attention quietly shifted toward the institution itself, it became clear that access inside Beth Israel was not a matter of security, but of hierarchy, where certain badges opened doors without triggering alarms, and certain names prevented questions from being asked. A review of stairwell maintenance records revealed the motion sensor had been recalibrated days earlier for false positives, a change approved without documentation, and cleaning schedules showed the stairwell had been sanitized unusually early the morning Elena was found, erasing potential trace evidence before investigators fully understood what they were dealing with. The sedative, once thought a minor anomaly, now appeared central, its sourcing limited to a controlled inventory signed out that night by someone who never logged its return, a discrepancy later explained away as a clerical error. Daniel, learning these details through his attorney rather than the police, began to understand that the narrative built around him had served a purpose, drawing attention outward while scrutiny was redirected inward and diffused through committees, reviews, and resignations that created the appearance of accountability without its substance. By the time a state oversight body expressed interest, key witnesses had left, records were sealed, and the moment for clarity had passed, leaving behind a case defined less by what could be proven than by what no one seemed willing to pursue. Elena Markov's death did not end with an arrest or a trial, but with a quiet institutional exhale. And in that silence, the most unsettling conclusion took shape: that in a place dedicated to healing, the systems designed to protect reputations may have worked far more efficiently than those meant to protect the truth. Years later, Elena Markov's name rarely surfaced outside of private conversations and old case files, yet her absence continued to ripple through the lives she had touched, and the institution that had quietly absorbed the shock of her death. Daniel Markov eventually left Boston altogether, carrying with him a reputation forever marked by suspicion, and a file stamped undetermined, a word that followed him more closely than guilt or innocence ever could, shaping every attempt at rebuilding a life that had been publicly dismantled. Inside Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, policies were updated, oversight committees renamed, and ethics trainings expanded, changes presented as progress, but never explicitly linked to the night Elena died, allowing the hospital to move forward without acknowledging what had forced those reforms into existence. Former colleagues began to speak in fragments years later, describing subtle pressures, unspoken expectations, and the quiet understanding that some findings were inconvenient in ways that could stall careers or erase funding, an environment where Elena's insistence on precision had slowly turned from asset to liability. A former administrator, long retired, privately confirmed that Elena's complaint had reached upper leadership and triggered concern not about its accuracy, but about its timing coinciding with a major funding renewal that leadership feared could collapse under scrutiny. The senior researcher who resigned had gone on to consult for private firms, untouched by formal investigation, while records connected to Elena's work remained sealed under institutional privilege, ensuring that no definitive narrative could ever fully emerge. Investigators who once worked the case admitted off the record that they had felt pressure to narrow their focus early, to resolve public anxiety quickly, rather than widen the scope toward an entity that could defend itself far more effectively than any individual suspect. Over time, Elena's death became a cautionary story, passed quietly among junior researchers and data analysts, a reminder that truth without power can be dangerous, and that integrity does not always come with protection. The final irony lingered in the hospital's continued reputation for excellence, where lives were saved daily under the same fluorescent lights that had witnessed Elena's last moments, reinforcing the unsettling reality that institutions do not need to be overtly corrupt to be complicit, only efficient, silent, and willing to let uncertainty stand in for justice. Long after the case had faded from headlines and internal briefings, small unresolved details continued to surface like pressure cracks, noticed only by those who still carried Elena Markov's story with them. A former night custodian, now retired, admitted years later that the stairwell where Elena was found had been cordoned off unusually fast that night, with supervisors instructing staff to continue cleaning despite police not having completed their initial walkthrough, a decision that at the time felt procedural but later seemed deliberate. An archived email chain, recovered during an unrelated audit, showed that hours before Elena's death, she had requested a meeting with an external compliance office unaffiliated with the hospital, marking the first clear indication that she intended to move beyond internal channels, a step that would have shifted control of the narrative entirely out of institutional hands. Security badge data, once thought inconclusive, revealed a brief overlap between Elena's last known movements and an unidentified access event that had been manually overridden, a rare action requiring elevated clearance and later justified as a system glitch that was never independently verified. Daniel Markov, informed of these findings long after he had stopped expecting answers, declined further interviews, stating through his attorney that reopening the case without transparency would only repeat the damage already done. A quiet acknowledgement that suspicion can be as permanent as conviction. Within Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, Elena's name was absent from official records of institutional change, yet the policies that followed her death bore the imprint of her concerns: tighter data auditing, mandatory third-party review triggers, and clearer whistleblower pathways that arrived too late to protect the person who inspired them. The story ultimately settled into an uncomfortable truth that no single act or individual could be isolated as responsible. Only a convergence of access, pressure, and silence that allowed doubt to replace accountability. In the end, Elena Markov did not become a symbol through memorials or public reckoning, but through absence, her case standing as a reminder that in environments built on trust and authority, the most dangerous moment is often when the system decides uncertainty is safer than the truth.